Welcome everyone. We are thrilled to have you with us for our October edition of the Brown Bag Series in Science here at ACSM. This is Lynette Kraft. I'm the Chief Science Officer, and I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Shawn Arent as our Brown Bag presenter this month. I'm going to give you a little history about Shawn, and then he will do his presentation. If you have questions, and we hope you do, please type those into the question box, and we will allow time at the end to take questions. So let me tell you a little bit about Shawn. Dr. Arent is an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Health at Rutgers University. He's the director of the Rutgers Center for Health and Human Performance and the director of the graduate program in Kinesiology and Applied Physiology. His research focuses on the relationship between physical activity and stress and the implications for health and performance. The primary emphasis of his research is in this area involves examining underlying endocrine mechanisms and biomarkers related to the HPA axis and inflammation. He is specifically interested in the potential efficacy of acute and chronic resistance training, as well as nutritional interventions for improving functional capabilities, mental health states, and the systemic response to stress in adolescents, athletes, and special populations. His recent work is primarily focused on physiological responses to training-related stressors and their contribution to optimal performance and recovery. Dr. Arent received his bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Virginia and his master's degree and doctoral degrees in exercise science from Arizona State University. He is also a fellow of ACSM and an associate editor for ACSM's Translational Journal. He was named the 2017 William J. Kramer Outstanding Sports Scientist of the Year Award by the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and he's also the current president of the International Society of Sport Nutrition. Finally, he's worked with teams in the NHL, Major League Baseball, U.S. Soccer Federation, and a number of teams at Rutgers. And today he's going to talk with us about his work using evaluation and application to optimize sport performance. So at this point, we're going to turn it over to Shawn. Again, if you have questions, type them in the question box, and we will take them at the end.
Great. Thank you very much. So thank you all for having nothing better to do on a Tuesday than listen to me for the next 30 minutes. I appreciate that. Hopefully some of the stuff that I'll talk about will have some impact. And, you know, a lot of what I'm going to focus on is how we take science from the lab into the field and how we do science in the field too. So here we go. Now, one of the most important things to understand, and I think part that is often missed when we talk about, especially working with high level and elite athletes, and that's a lot of what I'm going to focus on today, is the importance of context. We have to establish the setting, and we have to understand the players themselves, the needs of the athletes, and really what we're trying to accomplish. And I think it's important as a sports scientist to not only go in and basically tell them, here's what I can do for you, but you also need to ask the question of what do you need from me? And I think the more we collect data, look, data are just numbers, okay? And I think that one of the problems that's happening in sports science right now is you have a lot of people calling themselves sports scientists who are a little more than data analysts. To make you a sports scientist, you really need to be able to translate that data, compile the information, ultimately create the knowledge with that has relevance to what you're trying to do for the athletes you're working with, for the questions you're asking. And then over time, we can all hope that we develop wisdom in order to get us to a point where we have a systematic approach to this, and then we recognize that we have a unique opportunity, even within a team setting, to try to address the needs of the individual athlete, which is always a challenge. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is soccer. It's a massive part of what we do here. We work very closely with Rutgers women's soccer. We've worked closely with men's soccer here for a number of years as well. But some of the stories I'll tell you today will actually compare the two, which we find interesting. And a lot of what we've tried to do over the last 3 to 5 years is really focus on the female athlete and stop taking these findings that we get in male athletes and just trying to assume they apply. I think one of the things to start off with that's important to understand is the history of this. When we started working with women's soccer here, they had 5 times the national average for injury, ACL injury. In the first year that we worked with them, we were able to reduce injury by 70%. They made second round of NCAAs and haven't missed that mark in the last 6 years now. So consistently we've gotten there. And actually they're doing a remarkable job this year And I think there's going to be some relevance with some biomarkers I'll talk about later. One of the things is we actually just tied the NCAA record for most overtime games in a season with 11, and we haven't dropped a single one of those. So now we're heading into the Big Ten tournament. What I do want to point out, though, is the nature of the game itself. When we start talking elite players and even high level, because this is pretty consistent to what we're getting, we're seeing them cover anywhere from 10 to 12 kilometers or more in a 90-minute match. Throw in our 11 overtime games, and we're covering even more distance than that. And they're covering this at a pretty high intensity, at or above lactate threshold or ventilatory threshold in most cases. Doing 10 to 20 sprints, there's tackles, there's headers, there's involvements with the ball, passes, change of direction, stoppage, change of pace. So basically, we have to be aware that this is, while it is considered an endurance sport, it is a power endurance sport. So this notion of just training by running is certainly not what we want to target. The other thing, too, is when you consider how the distances are covered, you're talking about 4,000 meters covered jogging, a little over 2,000 meters covered running. We might sprint over 1,000 meters in a game, but there's also parts that are walking. And certainly that's where the players can sort of recover, catch their breath and be ready to go. What we found to be particularly important to us being a late game team and being able to finish games and score in added time, like we just did the other day, finally win in regulation, you do have to realize there's less distance covered in the second half, and sprint performance also goes down. All right, and we found that this also translates to overtime. When we go into added time, the speeds and droppages are pretty remarkable. And so our goal has always been to try to sustain performance for as long as possible, because if you can maintain that higher speed late in the game, you're making a 50-50 ball a 60-40 ball. And now you're getting to it, you're getting out of it, and you're not getting hit. All right, but the bottom line is, when we look at second half dynamics, even a proper warm-up before the second half can somewhat solve the sprint deficiency when we first start. So, for example, the first 5 minutes of either half and the last 5 are when most goals are scored, as well as after a goal. So what we want to do is have them come out of halftime and be ready to go. So we do another warm-up. We're thinking, they need to rest, they need to recover, things like that. The other thing, too, is fitness is a big part of this. If we can come in and we can sustain that intensity over the course of a game, fitness is going to help with that first issue in terms of the distance covered in the second half. And I would say for the first time in a while, we had such a remarkably productive offseason, and the girls really came in ready to go this year. And it's been amazing. I don't think we could have sustained what we've done had they not. So really the onus was on them, and they followed through. But when you see how these distances are covered, clearly the best training solution is not just to go run. All right, it's not just cover 5 miles, cover 6 miles, or whatever it is. We need to have a better strategic plan in terms of how we go about this. What we want to try to do is have a performance management cycle, right? So systematic evaluation is so key to what we do. And I think part of what we've done, and I'll talk about in a second, is the testing that allows us to monitor the progress of our athletes. Once you get that evaluation in terms of understanding really where we're currently at, then you can plan. All right, now how do we periodize the season? How do we structure our monitoring throughout the year in order to give us the feedback that we really need, that's most important to moving forward and progressing and really keeping the athlete healthy? And I think that for us has been an important lesson, is if you can keep the athlete healthy and on the field, you're going to win a lot more games. And then finally, reporting, right? How do we compile the information in a way that's useful to us as sports scientists, but then that's also useful to the coaches and the athletes to be able to do what they need to do and to put it into terms that the coach can understand. One thing I want to make really clear, if you're working in this area, is that if the coach doesn't understand or appreciate what you're trying to get them to do, you're not doing a good enough job explaining it. It's not their fault if they don't have an exercise science background. It's your job to put it into terms and convince them of why things are important, but you also need to listen to them to understand what their priorities are and how you need to meet their needs in order to get them to buy into this program. We've been very, very lucky to work around some coaches that are absolutely exceptional at being able to do that. So how do we make it work? First thing we integrated was testing. We're lucky enough to be able to do lab tests with these guys. And here's the thing, there's a lot of tests we could do, but you have to balance real and ideal. And so what we've basically boiled it down to with the teams we work with, especially in power endurance, is body composition, power, vertical jump, and VO2 max along with ventilatory threshold. And if we start with those as our core, that's really a big part. What we've layered on top of that is biomarker monitoring. And that's been very useful. On top of that, we also have a way to monitor going forward, and I'll get to that in a second. So we try to assess endurance, strength, and power. We also do strength testing with them now that they're training out of our facility. And so from a strength coach standpoint, we're very lucky to be able to get these values on them throughout the year to know we're making progress. And the more frequent assessment to some degree, the better. But you also have to realize we need to balance this with the demands of their other training. So we typically test at the beginning of preseason, at the end of the season, which I find to be incredibly valuable because it tells you how you maintained, progressed, or fell apart in season so you can do a better job next time. We test them when they come back from winter break, before they start their spring season, and then we test them before they leave for the summer. This way we know where they should be coming back. It's time well spent. And the coaches understand this and have bought in because they see the value in terms of what it does to allow us to program their monitoring systems. The other thing too is periodization. You have to prioritize. When you're working with college athletes, you don't necessarily have the luxury that this is all they do. So you need to prioritize which systems you're working on with them based on the results of the testing. And this is where you can individualize a bit. We really believe champions are built in the off season. Identify your weaknesses, work on those, and continue to maintain your strengths. And then you can move on from there to emphasize what you need to. And then third, monitor what you're doing. Recovery is so important, but so specificity. If we're not training like we want to play, we're not doing a very good job. And so our monitoring systems, from heart rate and GPS to biomarkers, allow us to identify how we're doing this in training, how we're doing this in games, and really do our best to budget the athlete and make sure that we're not overdrawn on our bank account with them. So monitoring has become a critical portion to what we actually try to do. The other part, though, is don't forget about cumulative effects. Training load monitoring is good, but it's just monitoring training. And the reality is, if they train 2 or 3 hours in a day, you got another 21 or 22 hours for them to have all kinds of other stuff going on. Not eating, not sleeping, life stress, relationships, classes, and things like that. And I think for us, when we start to put the assessments together, one of the pieces that biomarkers and the endocrine piece, given my background, has allowed us to do is gauge these other stressors and their impact on overall recovery, right? Life happens. And so when we start to look at it from that perspective, we don't just worry about what they're doing in training. We really worry about how they recover from that training because they have to do it again the next day. How do they recover from a game? Because they have to turn around and do it again. When you're in college soccer and you're playing like a Friday, Sunday schedule, it's barbaric, it's hard, and we need to be on top of recovery to make sure they're ready to turn around in 36 hours, replenish glycogen, and hit the field again. And it's a challenge to do. One of the things that you have to consider when you're picking your assessments is the evidence for meaningfulness. All right, there's a lot that we can do, and I'll tell you what, there are so many systems that pop up and so many things that are promised and whatnot, but not all of them have a solid scientific rationale. And I think we have to be a little bit better about how we choose those. But there has to be a meaningfulness, and it's really one of those things that, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing. If it's worth doing well, we really need to pay attention to how we want to pull this off. The other thing, too, is understanding timing. For example, if you're doing biomarkers, you don't want it repeated so often that you're getting spurious effects. And at the same time, if you measure it too infrequently, you miss some of the changes that occur. So we have to understand the time course of change as well as its proximity to training. We try to do it systematically where we're getting it about 18 to 24 hours after a match so that it's not completely acute, but what we're also getting is a measure of recovery. And we do this once a month, really once every 28 days, because we try to account for menstrual cycle in this. From a frequency standpoint, like I said, if it's too infrequent, it can be useless. You don't have an opportunity to change things. But if it's too frequent, it becomes burdensome. And now you're doing blood draws every week or every 2 weeks, and it's hard. It's funny, we just had a manuscript that we had submitted that got rejected. And one of the questions was, well, why didn't you do biomarkers every 2 weeks instead of every 4? Because it's impossible. All right, these are college athletes. It's a real world setting. And oh, by the way, we're not using recreationally trained participants. We're actually using competitive athletes. And so you have to make sure you also don't get in the way, because if it becomes too burdensome, they stop doing it. So you need to balance it as best as possible. And then finally, when we consider acute and chronic meetings, some markers have very different meanings in terms of acute or chronic elevations. Cortisol, acutely, absolutely necessary in terms of mobilizing fuels, getting the job done. But if it stays chronically elevated and we're in a constant state of breakdown, we've got a problem. All right, we see the same thing when we look at growth hormone in terms of its magnitude and meaningfulness. So ultimately, we're balancing what's important acutely and what's important chronically and trying to make positive judgments in terms of what this means for the athlete themselves. And we've had good success with that. And it's allowed us to identify when certain players need more rest and recovery and when some actually need more training to keep their fitness up with the rest of the starters so that if we need them, they're ready to go. So two key questions that I think are important to ask at any point. First, start with so what? All right, what does this all mean? If you see something change, so what? Like, what does that tell you? And then the second question you have to ask is, but now what do I do with it? There's really one big key that I share with all my grad students in terms of how we look at markers, at training load implications and things like that. Three things: see, say, do. All right, do you see it change? All right, if it doesn't change, I don't know how useful it's going to be from a monitoring standpoint. But then again, if it changes too quickly and it changes at any little stressor, that's not telling you much either. So you have to identify the patterns of change. All right, and I think that's way more important than absolute values. What are the changes that are occurring? Second thing is, if you see it change, what do you say about it? In other words, what does it mean? You know, if you can't explain to me why this marker is important or what it's telling us, it's fairly useless. So there has to be a so what to this. And then the third part that is so critical is, now what do you do about it? You could see something change, you might say it's important, but if you can't change it in terms of how you modify that, it's not doing you any good. All right, so you need to be able to do something about it and realize that when we do that, for anything to be appealing to athletes, it has to have impact. And they want to hear that they're going to be more fit, they're going to be better soccer players, better football players, whatever it is. But ultimately, health and performance don't have to be mutually exclusive. Unfortunately, sometimes working with medical staffs, they're so focused on the health aspect that they miss the fact that, yeah, they may be healthy enough to return to play, but it doesn't mean they're performance ready. And this is where the monitoring comes in. And there are differences in terms of medical clearance and performance clearance. The other thing, too, is it has to be easy enough to understand and important enough to impact preparation. There has to be enough of a so what to it that it allows you to modify their diet, modify their training, modify substitution practices in terms of what we'll do in game. And so really the thing we have to realize when we're communicating with the athletes is one of the most critical influences is typically not under their control: training. They're not necessarily in charge of their practice. They have to do what the coaches design. So what that means for us is there has to absolutely be buy-in at multiple levels in order for this to work. If you want to be a really great sports scientist, I recommend two things. One, work with great athletes, and two, work with great coaches. They make you look really smart, all right, because they're willing to buy in and do the whole program, and I think it's critical. The other thing that we have to realize is there is a risk and reward to relaying information. If you over inundate them and if you get too into some of the minutia, you risk paralysis through analysis, right? It's this marker does this and this marker does that, and it's back and forth. And then what happens is the player gets a little bit worked up. It's interesting. I was working with one of the professional teams I'd worked with. One of the devices they were using had a player readiness index. And the problem is, it was really only even semi-accurate if they were actually wearing it 24 hours a day, which most did not. So all of a sudden it says, you're not ready. Well, they're freaking out about it, right? And in fact, they were ready, but they see this number saying, oh, you're not prepared. So we have to be really careful how we relay the information and give them just what's necessary so that they can do their job. There's also psychological impacts, you know, the what, when, and how. When do you tell them about this? You also run into a situation with some athletic programs where they take a bit of an ostrich approach, right? Put their head in the sand. If you don't know something's wrong, you can't be criticized about it. So it's safer in some cases in their mind to do nothing. And that creates a big problem. At the professional level, as well as somewhat at the college level, you also have this fear of monitoring. Who gets the info? How is it used? Is it going to impact my playing time negatively? We try to make it very clear to the athletes that's not how we use this. We're using this to make sure they stay healthy so that they can contribute to the team. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do for them, to make it that much more feasible for them to reach and optimize performance. And that's really a critical part. What we're trying to do in this program is optimize performance through science, through the data we collect, and make them as good as possible. Because the other problem you have is who deciphers the information. You know, one problem we often deal with is, and it's not their fault, but physicians often don't deal in performance, they deal in health. So having somebody on staff or having a sports scientist that actually understands performance implications, I think is critical. And some of the things that we have out there in terms of monitoring systems and things like that, they may not be hard to use. Interpreting them as a different story, and not just anybody can do it in terms of at least do it well. Now, to give you an idea of how impactful this is, the graph you see right here is some data from one of our double overtime games. All right, and this is on the women's side. If you notice up near the top, all right, what's amazing here in terms of calories, we have athletes expending in excess of 2,000 to 2,500 calories in a double overtime match. As some of them have put to us now that they understand that, wow, that's a lot of food, all right? So we've really focused on them understanding nutrition as fuel, not as calories, as fuel, right? Feed the machine. The other thing too is when you start to look at distances covered, we're talking almost 8.5 miles plus in some cases for our center backs. All right, and when you look at the intensity, and this is heart rate data down through here, you see that they're spending a lot of time up here in these higher zones, all right? So clearly, and given the interval nature of the sport, this really is a power endurance type sport that we have to deal with. What was interesting to us is we compared the men's and women's game. Right, because this notion, you know, they seem to look different on the field. But here's the cool thing. When we looked at training load, all right, and then when we looked at distances, when you express it as a relative value, relative to their maximum, the men's and women's games are almost identical in terms of the strain on the players. What's interesting is from a substituted standpoint, when we include the subs in that second graph, what's remarkable is now the training load starts to change in game, mainly because the women typically use a slightly different substitution strategy. So they have more players that filter in. We're fortunate with our team to have a little bit more depth. So that's changed. The other thing too, though, is when we look at calories per kilogram. So again, when we express it relatively, and even when we look at distances covered, these games are remarkably similar, and so is practice. So now, if we look at this, one thought would be great, then all this stuff about males and females being different, it's the same game, we should see a similar response. Not so fast, because we also have biomarkers. And one of the things that we notice is even though the patterns over the course of a season, so the highest distances covered and training load and calorie expenditure is in that first month or so. They got like 2 weeks to get ready, then they got another first 2 weeks of the season. And so what happens is the coaches do a pretty good job of starting to manage that load as we get out of that early part. But when we look at what happens because of this, the damage is often already done. When we look at, for example, females in particular, and we look at both free and total cortisol, we see a pretty remarkable elevation in this. All right, and especially in that free cortisol coming out of preseason, we get an elevation that takes all the way until the end of the year before it returns to baseline. Creatine kinase continues to climb, especially in the males, partly due to the bigger body size. All right, but again, when you start to look at these graphs, the men and women do not necessarily respond the same, despite the fact that it's a similar load. The other thing, too, is when we look at iron, this was a really interesting story for us. All right, we actually saw on the women's side a pretty remarkable drop in iron that, again, even with nutritional supplementation to identify how to change this, took all the way to the end of the year in order to get back to where it should have been. So this is a pretty notable change. We're talking about over a 50% drop in iron for some of these players. Same thing we saw reflected in percent saturation, and then we're looking at chronically low ferritin, and so even in the men, we started to see some changes partway through the year, given the stress that's put on the body. By the way, this picture down here, that was the year we made it to the Final Four, which was pretty sweet. All right, then when we look at growth hormone, IGF-1, testosterone, and estrogen, again, we're getting pretty remarkable changes. And even in growth hormone, in the women in particular, we see, and it's one of the compensatory hormones for them to help with overall recovery, given their low testosterone. But what we see is a drop in growth hormone that persisted throughout the entire season. And this was mirrored in what we saw with IGF-1 as well. So as we start to see this, we start to realize what a strain the season places on them. And so what we've tried to do over the last few years is create an environment where we don't allow this to happen to the same degree. And as a matter of fact, this year we have a supplement study going on looking at relative energy deficiency and trying to supplement either protein or carbohydrate in both males and females to see if we can mitigate some of these changes and figure out if it's a macronutrient or total energy issue that's starting to impact them. All right, so keep an eye out for that one. Hopefully we'll wrap that up this year. The other thing that was pretty interesting for us from a bit of an unexpected finding, you often think as a coach or as a sports scientist that the more fit athlete, the better, right? Of course, yeah, they're going to be able to tolerate the stress better. We actually found what we're basically terming a fit athlete paradox. The most fit players coming into preseason in terms of higher VO2, lower percent body fat, actually had more perturbation of biomarkers than the other players did. And as a matter of fact, given the magnitude of change, you could fairly easily start to argue that we're bordering on overreaching. What it was is the more fit athletes were able to do more work. And so what they were doing is they were actually making up for the less fit players. And so what's happened is now when you have that ability to perform more work, with that high volume, short recovery time of preseason, we basically just put those higher level athletes at risk going into the rest of the year. Now that we've identified this, we started to modify how we approach preseason. And as a matter of fact, the coaches allow those more fit players more time out so that they're not constantly making up for the other players, and it allows the other players to get more time on the ball at the same time. And this has been a pretty reasonable management strategy for us going forward. Basically, what that did, that provided knowledge. Now here's a perfect example of context, because now we look at the strain of the preseason, we look at when this stress is incurred, and we look at why. And now we realize, wow, even these more fit athletes are undergoing more stress because they can do more work. We need to take care of them. So we've identified some individual differences, but what can the individual control? One of the big things is their diet off the field, and that's something we stress with them in terms of nutritional intake, their sleep, their life stress management, and things like that. So all those things that they can do from a recovery standpoint are very important. So that's what we work on with them. But at the organizational level, we've been able to put context to where the strain occurs and help the coaches who are absolutely exceptional at what they do and willing to do this, give the players the downtime they need. For example, again, 11 overtime games. What are we focusing on this week? Rest, because we've played enough soccer. So now going in, we're trying to be smarter than everybody else as best we can because we have the information. But if we account for overall stress, that's really been the missing piece of the puzzle. It's not just what's happening in training and games. You have team dynamics, you have relationships, you have school, you have exams, you have travel. So we put all this together and we start to realize that training load is an important piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole puzzle. And so as you layer in what is in the context of what the athlete can control, what the organization can control, and what influence we as sports scientists can have, those individual factors start to be important. We now identify the role of fitness and trying to bring everybody in as fit as possible so that they can tolerate the stress of preseason, and also identifying injury history. What are they coming off of? We have a couple players on the women's side who had mono in the spring and summer. We've had to manage them differently. And we've had to identify that because of a knock in training time for them, there were certain things we were going to have to do a little bit different in order to keep them on board. And I'll tell you what, they have been exceptional players this year because of what the coaches have been willing to do to manage them, especially in training. So what's moving the needle? Kind of interesting for us. We actually looked at what was predicting some of the changes in these biomarkers. And what we found was that average heart rate consistently accounted for the largest portion of the variance. So honestly, your on-field monitoring systems, even more than distance, the internal strain through heart rate monitoring was even more important. Not that the other things didn't matter, but ultimately when we put all of these things together, we accounted for as much as 25% of the variance in estradiol changes in the season and 21% of the variance in testosterone. So as we start to put this together and realize how we're impacting these markers that indicate strain and what we can do to measure them and now change our approach, that's really essential. So it's allowed us to take a much bigger view of what we're trying to do and make it a little bit more tailored to that particular athlete in order to pull that off. Now, one of the questions I often get is, hey, look, we don't have access to all these things. What can we do? How simple can we get? Well, you can start with sleep questionnaires. Even if you don't have sleep devices for tracking, sleep questionnaires have actually shown some utility. We've used them and actually found that sleep quality was the more important factor throughout the season than even sleep quantity. All right, so we use the Pittsburgh Sleep Inventory as some help with that. Mood. Now, here's an interesting one. It was always suspected that changes in mood were one of the best predictors of overtraining or overreaching. Given what we've been able to do with biomarkers, we actually found a number of biomarkers linked to mood. So for example, tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin, cortisol because of the role with the HPA axis and things like that, that actually preceded the changes in mood, which preceded changes in performance. So as a matter of fact, even if you can't monitor the biomarkers, mood did change before we saw changes in power. RPE can be useful, and there was just an article that just came out on this today. I think Trent Stellingwerf does excellent work in this. But I will say working with field athletes in particular, this is a challenge because it's a question of being able to evaluate the whole practice. And there's a recency effect. So if you finish with sprints or something more high intensity, how did you evaluate the whole session? The other thing that we've run into, and I've had colleagues at the professional level say that they've dealt with this as well, athletes lie, right? They want to play, so they don't want to admit it's hard. We've got a boxer that we work with, love him to death. And it's funny, if you're doing anything with him and you're asking him for RPE on the Borg scale, so between 6 and 20, everything's a 7. Because he will not admit it's hard. So certainly there's that aspect. I think when you're doing more steady state type of work or a more consistent workout in terms of all HIIT within that training session, RPE can be fairly useful. We haven't relied on it too much. And then what about some easy performance tests? You know, we use vertical jump through the season. You can do it pretty quick. Once a month, we'll also do body composition. All right, to make sure they're not losing muscle, which is important for us. And so really that notion of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, like I said, we're seeing some of these physiological changes before we see performance changes. And in the middle of that are some of the mood issues. So we're starting to realize that some of the physical strain may be setting up those mood changes, which then translate to where we start to see performance downturn. The other thing too is, again, the athlete is your wild card. How willing are they to admit and acknowledge this? And then you just have some athletes where everything's hard. I will say this, when you do this right, it's amazing. As an athlete, you often go through it. I've been lucky to play at a high level, but then to work with these guys. It's unbelievable. And so what's really cool though is you start to realize that how they interpret things starts to become very different, but they start to just kind of think that, hey, yeah, I'm tired, but that's normal because I train hard. When you start fueling them appropriately, it is amazing to see the response when they go, wow, I feel good, right? They're just used to going through life in this state of depletion. And when they start sleeping enough and eating enough, it is amazing what we can do. That being said, you play 11 overtime games, no matter what, you're going to be tired, or no matter how much we fed them. So one of the messages we often have is hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard, right? And this is true, given that intensity and given that work dynamic. But I will also say this, smart work beats talent when talent doesn't work smart either. And so being able to apply scientific principles, data analysis in a team type of setting with these athletes has allowed us to move from the lab to the field and take a solid scientific theoretical approach, but also understanding the difference between real and ideal. And there are certain things that you can integrate and certain things that you don't have the time for. And I think as a sports scientist, if you want to start working with these teams, be very selective in what you do so that you don't overburden them, but you also measure the things that most need measuring. And when you do that, you're adding to the science and you're also adding to their success. And one of the things I will say that I love about this, sometimes we wonder how big of an impact our work has. I can say for certain that there's 30 young women that saw the value of the work when they made the Final Four for the first time in program history. And I think that knowing that you can have that impact is remarkable. And being able to work with them at multiple levels has been absolutely phenomenal. And we've been lucky to be able to look at some of the scientific outcomes that we've gotten along the way. So the bottom line is it's not magic, it's science. All right? There's nothing predictive about this. And be very careful in this field not to get caught up in the scienciness. There's a lot of that around different measurement tools. There's a lot of that around different methods of training. These are tools, though. Choose the right one for the job. And by all means, please avoid data diarrhea. Just because you can measure it doesn't mean you should. All right, so we want to be selective in that. And if it's worth doing, it's worth doing well. But there's a flip to that, because if you can't do the things that will most benefit the athletes, at the same time, if it's not worth doing well, it's not worth doing. So make sure that you follow through on whatever you integrate that is most important for those players and those coaches in order to give them the most vital information. Bottom line is, there's a Goldilocks principle here. Right? We can definitely do too much in terms of the things we try to pull off with them. And sometimes we don't do quite enough. But the bottom line is, if you nail it just right in the middle and we start to figure out what matters and what moves the needle and where you can make the biggest impact in the shortest period of time and do a really good job with that. And I will say this, rather than picking 4 or 5 or 6 things you can do, pick 2 or 3 and just do them really well. Really well. Just nail it. You will be amazed at what the performance outcomes can be, and more importantly, what it does for the health of the athlete. And even over the years, we've identified some pretty notable medical issues in a handful of players that we wouldn't have picked up on otherwise. And many of them came back to have a very successful career after it was corrected. And so we've been very fortunate with that. And I can't say enough about the quality of the players and the quality of the coaches that allow us to do this in this particular way and have a heck of a good time doing it. That being said, I'd also like to acknowledge my lab staff. I've got a great group of master's and doctoral students. Our director of training and conditioning, full disclosure, this is my wife, Michelle. She's also the strength coach and sport nutritionist for Rutgers women's soccer. So we work incredibly well as a team. Thank you to Quest and Blueprint for Athletes for what we've been able to do with the biomarker work, and for Rutgers Soccer and the New Jersey Institute for Food, Nutrition, and Health for giving us the freedom to explore the sports science side of things and work with real athletes. And I think from our standpoint, that has been an absolute blessing. And I thank you guys for your attention. Hopefully you learned a little bit, and we would be happy to take some questions now.
Great. Thank you, Shawn. That was an awesome presentation. We are going to take some questions now. I'm going to get us started. We actually have some staff here in the national office who are participating, and then we have lots of folks joining remotely. So we'll sort of be bouncing back and forth between those two. Just to start us off, it sounds like having an interdisciplinary team would be really important to this approach. So can you talk to the extent to which you bring in nutritionists and other types of sports scientists?
Yeah, and I think it depends on where your focus is. At this university, we don't have a biomechanics influence. At others, they do. And it's funny because even in some other areas, they have more biomechanics than exercise physiology. So I think it's also important to understand what your strengths and limitations are. And you're right, in some ways, having this interdisciplinary team, and even more so than that, it's just putting this performance team together in terms of the sports science, the strength and conditioning, the nutrition, the sports medicine. And I will say this, our athletic trainer, Tracy from Rutgers women's soccer, is absolutely phenomenal. So to be able to integrate on the medical side and have her help us identify what the issues are she's seeing have been great. And I will say, when you start to put that whole program together, right? Science, nutrition, which is science as well. Strength and conditioning, also science. All right, when we start to do all of that, honestly, we've had, and again, knock on wood, we still got a bit of the season to go here. We're still not done with our mission. We've had 1 season-ending injury in the last 4 years. That's fairly remarkable. And again, I chalk that up to the fact that we've approached this from an interdisciplinary standpoint. I will say there are absolutely challenges integrating with athletics in many cases, and this isn't just unique to us, but there are sometimes artificial walls and there's some resistance. And I think when we've been able to break down those walls and everybody works together, understanding that it's not about egos, but about the fate of the athlete, good stuff happens. And I think that coaches are influential in being able to demand that and need that for their team. And so in some ways, they're the ones that allow the interdisciplinary approach to happen in the first place.
Awesome, thanks. So let's see. I'm going to take a question from one of our remote viewers. Okay, so as far as biomarkers, you mentioned it happens once a 28-day cycle.
Yeah.
Does that mean you've individualized the timing of the blood draw to happen on a certain day in their cycle? Or are you just consistent on when it happens during their cycle?
Just consistent when it happens. And you know, it's funny, we get this question a lot. And honestly, it drives me nuts a little bit, not for whoever asked the question. It's actually a great question, but it's the lack of realization that these players don't pick and choose their game schedule based on their menstrual cycle. So the reality is we're trying to be consistent when we measure them, and using a 28-day cycle as our benchmark. Reality is some of the girls are amenorrheic, some are oligomenoreic, and some are eumenorrheic. So we're putting it in a real world setting. And I think one of the, and to me, this has been one of the biggest limitations in the research on female athletes, is this need to try to control everything, because it really takes away the real world setting of what happens in athletics. You know, and I think if you look at a lot of the overreaching and overtraining literature, it's flawed in one big respect. We try to bring them into the lab, jack up volume for a few weeks and go, oh, look, this did or didn't predict it. You know, the problem with that is you've now taken away all of the other aspects of competition. You know, you're now not accounting for game stress and travel and life and the other things that go into the intensity of practice and stuff like that. So I think that at some point we get so caught up on the science side of control that we lose the reality of sport. And I'm fine with that on our end in terms of taking a more translational approach. And I know some people have an issue with that, and that's fine. But I would probably say that the meaningfulness of what we're finding and how it would translate and be used in a setting is far more applicable.
Okay, great. So this is a question about monitoring training load. It says, assuming players wear those accelerometer vests during training, how do you use all that data? And what data is most important in monitoring daily training loads in the match-dense college season?
Yeah, so certainly the accelerometer GPS stuff is useful for us in terms of what we start to look at is the number of sprints, time spent in the higher speed zones, and even within a game, we'll start to look at where that falls off in terms of when to substitute a player as we're losing some of that speed aspect. And obviously some of it you can see, and other times it helps to have the data to back it up. And then within the training aspect, really, to be honest, we rely probably more heavily on heart rate than on GPS data because it's a better reflection of internal strain and somebody's ability to handle different speeds because they're faster, you know, or longer distances because of their endurance. That also gets reflected in the physiological response. And so we rely fairly heavily on that. But what we try to do is probably the best way I can explain it is when we look at training load and all the factors that go into calculating training loads. That's not the only thing we use. As a matter of fact, we rely pretty heavily on calorie expenditure. But let's say, for example, we use a metric like training load, which can be calculated a few different ways. We look at it like a bank account. And you have a given number, and it depends on your team to a great degree. We've sort of found a sweet spot for our players in terms of where they tend to perform best without breaking down. Well, what we'll do is, let's say, for example, you have 12 or 1,300 points in a week where we tend to find the upper end of where we start to get downturn. All right, that's a bank account, which means that you now have to account for withdrawals in training and in games. And it's up to the coaches to decide where that's more important for them. And so if we know, for example, that we might get 400 plus points in a match, and we've got 2 matches, like I said, in that condensed season, and we have to go back to back like that, we're going to have to limit our withdrawal in practice. And so now we'll keep points in check. And so they're monitoring training load throughout the session in order to know when to pull players in order to keep our bank account in balance. And I think when we approach it that way, it allows us to monitor the individual because training load is relative to their maximums and their capabilities. And then we back that up with the biomarkers to know where we're starting to get positive or negative changes in order to influence how we proceed from there in terms of rest and recovery. But the other way we use those numbers that's really important is to give the athletes a sense for what they need to do to recover. Here, you covered this distance. Here's how many calories you expended. You need to eat this much food. And with female athletes, sometimes that's hard. And they when you just straight up tell them, hey, yeah, you need to eat like 4,000 calories a day. And they look at you like you got 2 heads. And like, no way, I'll get fat. Until they actually see, oh, wow, in one game, you burned 2,500 calories, and that doesn't account for the rest of the day. In a training session, it was 800 to 900. And all of a sudden, it starts to have context. And it's easier to get them to understand the value of fuel and not just worry about the calorie numbers, but what that's actually allowing them to do to perform.
Great. So there's a question about injury, and are you tracking injury over the season, and are you looking at any of these assessments that are predictive of injury?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we just did a big study with University of Connecticut last year as part of the an NCAA study. And actually, some of those data are about to start coming out. But we actually did full injury surveillance through the season, looking at the impact of training load and things like that. We also have the biomarker data. And so we're starting to look at some of that. But fortunately, in terms of soft tissue and severe injury, we can access some of that. The funny thing is, injury modeling is a challenge, and injury prediction, I think, is a really poor term. It's more often injury confirmation, and sometimes hindsight's 20/20. But certainly, there's no probably one thing we look at that would give the biggest indicator of injury, but that's some of the data we're analyzing right now to actually see what created or was tied to players that lost time due to injury. On our end, it's a little bit odd because we've actually been pretty successful at avoiding a lot of injury. And actually, it was funny this year. I think most of our injuries in terms of time lost were in freshmen. And they came in, and so they hadn't been training with us for a while. And that unique load of a college season is pretty remarkable for them. So we're looking at some hamstring stuff here and there, and a few that, kind of got shelved and will probably just redshirt this year. But in terms of starters, we've been fortunate not to lose a lot for, maybe more than a game or 2 at times. So it's kind of hard to say. And so for us, being able to mitigate some of the physiological downturn is more than likely part of what's allowed us to, avoid some of those other things. But yeah, injuries happen, and it's a part of the sport. And some of them you can't predict, right? If you're going up for a header and you get an elbow thrown at your head, how do you code that one in terms of prediction of injury? So those are things we're looking at. And I got to give credit to the group up at the Corey Stringer Institute at UConn for helping to spearhead that and integrating the data. I think Doug Casa, Rob Huggins, and those guys are doing a pretty phenomenal job as well.
Great. All right. We're going to be really respectful of Shawn's time, and we're going to take 2 more questions, and then we're going to wrap up. So the first question is, how did you go about explaining to the fitter athletes, more fit athletes at the beginning of the season, that they may need less in the preseason? You could imagine the perception of the athlete could be all over the place with respect to that.
Yeah. So basically, it was pretty simple. Here was the conversation. Hey, so look, what's most important is that you're ready for the Final Four because we want to make the College Cup again. So we're going to manage you earlier in the season so you don't break down. Is that cool? They look at us and go, yes, sounds good to me. Good, we're done. So really, when you build a relationship and you've built trust over those years, they look at you like they want to play, but they also understand there's a reason for why we do what we do. And then when they also realize that that means that the other players are going to get a chance to get more time on the ball and help condition them moving into the season, it was a pretty good buy-in. And I think that we just make it very clear this is not meant to penalize you. This is actually meant as a reward for the fact that you did what you were supposed to in the offseason. We need you throughout the year. We can't have you breaking down in month number 1. Communication is essential. And that's probably the part I should have stressed even more is how you say it, who you say it to, and when you say it, all of that matters. And so Lynette, I know you can appreciate the psychological side of that, but absolutely that ability to relay the information in a meaningful way to them and help them to understand. And I'll say, here's the thing is the onus is on us to explain. And if I can't do that, I need to do better. If they don't understand, it means I'm not explaining well enough. So I take that on us in terms of our responsibility as scientists to do a better job putting it into terms that they can appreciate.
Great. All right, final question. So for the average person who works out 5 or 6 days a week, is busy, has life stress, or maybe for one of our health and fitness professionals who's not working with elite athletes but is working with the average person in the gym, are there things that we can do that you're having your athletes do, like tracking sleep, mood, food, activity, things like that?
Yeah, I think, even just basic tracking of performance, right? If you see your strength starting to drop or you're constantly tired, reevaluate. But, here's the thing. If you train hard, if you eat quality food, start with protein, fill in around it, right? Enough to fuel your workouts on the carbohydrate side, and sleep. If you start with those big 3, you'll be amazed at what that takes care of. And certainly, we deal with supplementation with some of our athletes at the professional level more than even the college level because of what's allowed or not allowed by NCAA. We might emphasize creatine and beta-alanine and things like that. But, one of the first things we teach our athletes is, protein is not expendable. In other words, that's what you start with in terms of how much you eat in a day. And even if you're trying to drop body fat, we don't cut that. We fill in around it with everything else. The other thing, too, that the average individual can also use that we use with our athletes is nutrient periodization. You don't have to eat like high carb all the time if you consider yourself to, for performance. There might be on your lower training days or recovery days, maybe you don't eat as much. With our athletes, in season, we're trying to fuel. I mean, it's a challenge over the course of a week to get enough in to last us through games. But in the off season, if we're trying to remodel some of the athletes a little bit and maybe drop a little body fat and gain some muscle, whatever it is, we can modify when we have this high intake. And really in the spring, when they're not playing as much as they were in season, they don't eat as much, and so we're enough to fuel, certainly, and enough to repair and get stronger. But I think for the average individual, pay attention to how you feel. I would say on the monitoring side, use it, but use it judiciously. In other words, don't over rely on it. Like, for example, our athletes, they rarely see their numbers. They don't rely on the heart rate monitors. We use them. And so then it translates. That way, they're not overly worried about what was my heart rate, what was this. They ask, and we'll tell them, but their job is to go out and play and pay attention to how they feel. Same thing for the other individuals. If you've got an activity tracker, a wearable, if you're doing biomarkers, use that to back up what you're doing so you understand how good really feels, and use that as your barometer, and then follow up with that from time to time to recalibrate. All right, you don't have to rely on it every minute of every day, and don't get caught up just in the technology, but use the technology for you rather than letting the technology use you. And I think that is probably where we've learned some valuable lessons along the way.
Great. All right. Thank you, Shawn. This has been really, really interesting and insightful. And I think your work is really such a nice blend of science-based, but then the application to athletes and evaluation and monitoring piece, I think, is something that, is really important that everyone think about incorporating to the extent that they can. So we really appreciate your time today.
Awesome.
With that, our ACSM crew here is going to give Shawn a big round of applause, and we're going to say goodbye to everyone else. Thanks again, Shawn.
Thank you, everybody. My pleasure.